The carriage came on a Tuesday. Lydia heard it before she saw it. The crunch of wheels on the lane, the heavy rhythm of a four-horse team that no one in this village owned. She was in the garden with Tom. He was digging in the vegetable patch with a wooden spoon. Not a gardening tool, but he had decided with the absolute conviction of a 3-year-old was the only implement suitable for the task. His knees were black with soil. His brown curls were stuck to his forehead. He was talking to a worm he had found, explaining to it, with great seriousness, that it lived in the ground because it did not have legs, and that this was not the worm's fault. Lydia was kneeling beside him, tying runner beans to a cane frame. Her hands were in the soil. Her black mourning dress, the only dress she owned that still fit properly because grief had thinned her, was muddy at the knees. Her hair, which was black and thick and curly, and had never in her 30 years submitted to a pin, without a fight, had escaped its arrangement and was falling around her face in the way it always did by mid-morning, comprehensively. She heard the carriage. She looked up. She saw the Carlisle crest on the door, and her hands went still in the soil. "Mama," Tom said. "The worm went back." "Yes," she said. "It did. Should I dig for it?" "No, love. Leave it be. Let the worm go home." She stood. She wiped her hands on her apron. She picked up Tom, who protested because the worm situation was unresolved, and she walked to the front of the cottage where the carriage had stopped and 2 people were stepping out. Sir Geoffrey Carlisle, her dead husband's father, 65 years old, tall, heavy through the chest and shoulders, silver-white hair combed back from a broad forehead, cold grey eyes that assessed everything and gave approval to almost nothing. He wore a fine black coat, not mourning black, just expensive black, and he carried a leather folio under his arm like other men carry walking sticks, as a prop that said something about the person holding it. Behind him, Lady Frances Carlisle, 60. Silver-grey hair pulled tight beneath a bonnet, thin lips, pale blue eyes that held the temperature of a February morning, not frozen, not warm, present in the way that cold is present when it has decided to stay. She wore dark grey silk with a jet brooch at her throat, and she looked at the cottage, at the garden, at the mud on Lydia's knees, at the child on her hip, with an expression that was not contempt. It was something more careful than contempt. It was evaluation. "Lydia," Sir Geoffrey said. "No, my dear, no good morning, just the name, delivered like a fact. Sir Geoffrey, Lady Carlisle." Lydia shifted Tom on her hip. He had buried his face in her neck, which he did when strangers arrived, because Tom had learned since his father's death that strangers arriving meant something was changing, and changes, in his experience, were not improvements. "We should go inside," Sir Geoffrey said. "We can speak here. This is not a conversation for a garden, Lydia." "Everything in my life happens in this garden, Sir Geoffrey. Say what you have come to say." He looked at her, at the small woman in the muddy dress with the hair falling around her face and the child on her hip, and the defiance in her eyes that he had never liked, that he had warned his son about, that Thomas had married anyway, because Thomas, God rest him, had been a man who made decisions with his heart and paid for them with everything else. Sir Geoffrey opened the leather folio. He removed a document. He held it out. "We have filed a petition for custody of the boy." The words landed in the garden the way a stone lands in still water. The surface broke. The circles spread. The water did not recover. "On what grounds?" Lydia's voice was steady. This steadiness cost her something. The listeners would hear the cost, but she held it. "On the grounds that you are unable to provide for him, that you have no income, no family of means, no prospects of remarriage, and no resources sufficient to raise a child of Thomas's standing. The petition is filed under the Custody of Infants Act. The hearing will be in Salisbury before the magistrate in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, 42 days, Lady Frances spoke. Her voice was soft. It was the softness that was dangerous, the softness of a woman who had rehearsed her cruelty until it sounded like kindness. We only want what is best for the boy, Lydia. Thomas, our Thomas, would have wanted him raised properly, in a home with means, with education, with the name he was born to carry. Your Thomas, Lydia said, wanted his son raised by his mother. He said so, in this garden, 3 weeks before he died. Thomas was ill. He was not thinking clearly. Thomas was dying. He was thinking more clearly than he ever had. Tom lifted his head from her neck. He looked at his grandfather with the uncomplicated directness of a child who does not yet understand that some adults are dangerous. I found a worm, he said. Sir Geoffrey looked at the boy. Something moved in his face, something that was not cruelty, not indifference, but a possessive grief that had attached itself to this child because the child was the last piece of a son he had lost. The grief was real. That did not make the petition less destructive. It made it more, because a man acting from genuine feeling is harder to fight than a man acting from malice. Malice can be exposed. Grief cannot. 6 weeks, Sir Geoffrey said. He placed the document on the garden wall. He returned to the carriage. Lady Frances followed, pausing only to look at Tom, at the muddy hands, the wooden spoon still clutched in his fist, the brown curls that were his father's, with an expression that was, for one moment, unguarded. She missed her son. She saw her son in this boy, and she was going to take the boy to fill the hole the son had left. The carriage pulled away. Lydia stood in the garden with Tom on her hip and the document on the wall and the runner beans untied and the worm gone back into the earth. She would cry later, after Tom was asleep, in the kitchen, with her hands flat on the table and her forehead pressed against the wood, the way she had cried every night for 6 months, silently, thoroughly, and alone. But not now. Not with Tom on her hip and his hand on her collar and his voice in her ear saying, "Mama, the worm," with the insistence of a person whose priorities are clear and whose world, for the moment, is still intact. "Yes," she said, "let's go find the worm." Lydia Marsh was born in 1813 in a village outside Salisbury, Wiltshire, the second of 4 children. Her father was a clergyman, the Reverend James Marsh, who believed, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had read too many books and not enough balance sheets, that education was the highest gift a parent could give. He educated all 4 children equally. In the social economics of 1820s England, this was borderline reckless. The world required women to be decorative. The Reverend Marsh had decided, without consulting the world, that his daughters would be capable instead. Lydia was the capable one, not the pretty one. That was her elder sister Jane. Not the quiet one. That was the younger, Anne. Lydia was the one who argued at dinner, who corrected the curate's sermon at 14, who could calculate the yield of the glebe field faster than the land agent, and who, by 18, had read every book in her father's study and started on the lending library in Salisbury. She was small, 5 feet 3, slight, small-boned, with the wrists of a child and the grip of a woman who had spent her girlhood hauling water from the well and wood from the copse, because the Marsh family employed no servants, and the Reverend believed in physical work the way he believed in Latin as a foundation for character. Her face was heart-shaped, pointed chin, high cheekbones, a small mouth that could hold a great deal of expression in very little space. Her skin was fair and flushed easily. A blush that started at her collarbone and worked upward, betraying every emotion she tried to conceal, most of them. Her eyes were dark blue, the deep blue of a winter sky just before dark, vivid enough to notice, dark enough to hold things in. People remembered her eyes before they remembered her name, which was the kind of feature that would have been useful if she had been taller, richer, or quieter. She was none of these things. Her hair was black. Not the polished, sleek black of a woman who spent hours with a brush and a mirror. The unruly, thick, curly black of a woman who had been fighting her own hair since childhood, and losing. It sprang from pins. It escaped bonnets. It framed her face in a dark halo that made her look, depending on the light, either striking or slightly mad. Lydia had given up controlling it around the age of 20 and had settled for containing it, a different project with a lower success rate. She met Thomas Carlisle at a county assembly when she was 24. He was 26, the younger son of Sir Geoffrey, not the heir, which mattered more than it should have. The older brother, Richard, had inherited the estate and the title and moved to London, where he sat in Parliament and showed no interest in Wiltshire, or in his brother's choices, or in anything that did not directly affect his political career. Thomas would inherit a small living, an education, and the permanent knowledge that he was the spare. Thomas was, and I need you to understand who she lost, kind. Kind the way some men are foolish, completely, without reservation, against all practical advice. He was tall and thin, with brown curly hair and brown eyes that held the warmth of a man who had decided early that the world was difficult and that his contribution to it would be gentleness. He read poetry. He taught Sunday school. He brought stray dogs home and named them after philosophers. This drove his father mad because Sir Geoffrey did not believe dogs required names, let alone the names of Greeks. Thomas saw Lydia across the assembly room. She was standing near the wall, not dancing, because no one had asked her and because she had been watching the dancing with the analytical attention of a woman who was calculating how many calories the quadrille burned per minute and whether the same energy might be better applied to digging a drainage ditch. He crossed the room. This was the first brave thing he did. "You look," he said, "like a woman who is solving a mathematical problem. I am estimating the inefficiency of social dancing as a form of exercise. And your conclusion? Significant. A woman could dig a garden bed in the same time it takes to complete a cotillion and produce something that actually grows." He laughed. The laugh was sudden, genuine, and loud enough that his mother, across the room, turned to see what had caused it and found her younger son talking to a clergyman's daughter with no fortune and wild black hair and an opinion about drainage. Lady Frances did not approve. The disapproval travelled from Frances to Sir Geoffrey to Thomas, who told Lydia on their third meeting in her father's garden. He had come to return a book he could have sent by post, but the book was an excuse, and they both knew it. "My parents do not approve," he said. "Of what specifically?" "Of you, of us, of the general concept of their son marrying a woman who has opinions about drainage. I also have opinions about crop rotation, tenant rights, and the improper use of Latin in country sermons. Should I compile a list?" "Please don't. My father already has one." They married in June of 1837. Sir Geoffrey did not attend. Lady Frances sat in the back pew and left before the breakfast. Thomas had £200 a year from a trust his grandmother had established. Enough for a cottage, not enough for the life Sir Geoffrey believed his son deserved. They rented a place in Hartfield, 4 miles from the Carlisle estate, 3 rooms downstairs, 2 above, a garden that Lydia turned, within 2 years, into something remarkable, Runner beans, cabbages, potatoes, herbs, 3 apple trees she had grafted herself, and sweet peas along the south wall that made the cottage look, from the lane, like a small defiant declaration that beauty did not require money. They were happy. I need to say this plainly because the next hour will test it. They were happy in the imperfect, stubborn way that 2 people are happy when they have chosen each other against advice and are building something from materials the world considered not enough. Thomas taught at the village school 3 days a week. Lydia kept the cottage, the garden, the chickens, and the accounts. They read to each other in the evenings. They argued about books. Thomas preferred poetry. Lydia preferred history. And their arguments about whether Wordsworth was a better use of an evening than Gibbon were ongoing, affectionate, and unresolvable. Tom was born in 1840. Thomas was 29. Lydia was 27. The pregnancy was difficult. Lydia was small, the baby was not. And for 3 days in September, the village midwife and the surgeon from Salisbury traded places at her bedside while Thomas sat in the garden and dug a hole for a plum tree because digging was the only thing his hands could do that was not praying or shaking. Tom arrived. He was healthy. He was loud. He had his father's brown curls and his mother's dark blue eyes, and Thomas held him for the first time with the careful, terrified reverence of a man who has been handed something he is not sure he deserves. "He is perfect," Thomas said. "He is screaming," Lydia said. "Perfectly." They had 3 years. 3 years of Tom growing, of the garden producing, of Thomas teaching and Lydia managing, and the cottage being small and warm, and theirs. 3 years of ordinary happiness, the kind people do not notice until it is taken. Sir Geoffrey visited twice during those 3 years. Both visits were brief, formal, and conducted with the discomfort of a man who believes his son has failed and is looking for evidence to confirm it. He looked at the cottage. He looked at the garden. He looked at Tom crawling on the kitchen floor with soil on his hands and chickens visible through the window and Lydia chopping vegetables for soup. He saw insufficiency. The cottage was too small. The income was too little. The wife was too common. The child was being raised in a kitchen garden when he should have been raised in a nursery with a nurse and a tutor and the resources that a Carlisle grandson deserved. "The boy could have more," he said to Thomas on the second visit. "The boy has enough," Thomas said. "Enough is not what a Carlisle aims for." "Then perhaps I am not a very good Carlisle." "On that, Thomas, we agree." Thomas died in March of 1843, consumption. The cough had started the previous autumn, dry at first, then wet, then bloody. Lydia had watched it come the way you watch weather cross a valley, knowing what it was, unable to stop it, counting the days between the first cloud and the rain. The surgeon from Salisbury came twice. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and a tincture of coltsfoot that cost 6 shillings and did nothing. Thomas rested. The consumption did not. He was sick for 12 days. Lydia nursed him. She slept on the floor beside the bed, the same way she had slept beside Tom's cot during the croup at 18 months. On a folded blanket, one hand reaching up to touch the person she was watching, because touch was the only medicine she had, and she was not going to withhold it. Thomas died on a Tuesday, in the morning, with the window open because Lydia believed, irrationally, superstitiously, against every rational principle her father had taught her, that the soul needed a way out. Tom was asleep in the next room. The chickens were audible in the garden. The runner beans were beginning to climb their frames. His last words were, "Read to him every night. Promise me." She promised. She has kept the promise every night since, a story before bed. Tom's favorite is about a badger who lives under a hill and who has, according to Lydia's nightly invention, 17 children and a complicated relationship with a family of foxes. The story has no ending because every night Tom asks, "And then what happened?" And every night Lydia invents the next chapter, and every night the badger survives. After Thomas died, the cottage became hers alone. The rent was £6 a year, paid from what remained of the trust. The trust itself, this is the detail that determines everything, had been established for Thomas's lifetime. Upon his death, it ceased. £200 a year became nothing, overnight, the way a candle becomes nothing when you blow it out. The wick remains, the wax remains, the capacity for light remains. But the income does not. Lydia had no inheritance. She had no family money. The Reverend Marsh was alive but elderly, living on his clergyman's stipend, supporting her mother and her younger sister. She had no widow's jointure. Thomas had nothing to join. She had the cottage, the garden, the chickens, and the contents of a house that, if sold, would raise perhaps £40. She needed income. In 1843, a widow of the gentry class, even the very lowest fringe of the gentry class, had limited options. She could not take employment without losing the social standing that was, ironically, the only asset she had left. A woman who worked was a woman who had fallen, and a woman who had fallen was a woman whose character could be questioned, and a woman whose character was questioned was a woman who could lose her child. This is the trap, the system that Lydia was living inside. The law said she could keep Tom if she proved good character. The economy said she could not survive without working. And the social code said that working destroyed her character. The three systems, legal, economic, social, interlocked like the gears of a machine designed to produce one outcome. A woman alone cannot keep her child. Lydia understood the machine. She had her father's mind, the mind that calculated yields and corrected sermons and assessed the inefficiency of dancing. She looked at the three systems, and she saw what they were. Not separate problems, but one problem with three faces. She took in sewing. She sold vegetables from the garden. Quietly, through the kitchen door, not at market. She bartered eggs for flour. She repaired lace for the draper's wife in exchange for fabric. She kept every transaction below the level of visibility, because visibility meant gossip, and gossip meant character, and character meant Tom. She was surviving, narrowly, exhaustingly, alone. The cottage was cold in winter. The roof leaked in one corner, and she could not afford the thatcher. Tom grew out of his clothes, and she remade Thomas's shirts into small garments with uneven hems and careful stitching. She read to him every night. She kept the garden. She did not ask for help. Mrs. Lowell noticed. Ada Lowell lived in the cottage next door, 55 years old, a widow herself. Her husband, a tenant farmer, had died 15 years ago. Her son, Peter, had died of scarlet fever at 7, 20 years before that. She had survived both losses, too dense to erode and too stubborn to move. Ada Lowell was not the kind of woman who brought casseroles or offered hugs or said, "If there's anything I can do." She was short, broad, with steel-gray hair, she cut herself with kitchen scissors, and brown hands that were never idle, and a face that carried, at rest, the approximate warmth of a January flagstone. What she did was this. On a Wednesday morning, Lydia woke to the sound of hammering. She went outside and found Ada Lowell on the cottage roof, with a bucket of pitch and a handful of slates, patching the leak in the corner that had been dripping into Tom's room for a month. No note, no announcement, no, "I noticed your roof was leaking and thought I'd help." Just a woman on a roof at 7 in the morning with pitch on her hands. The following Wednesday, a stack of cut firewood appeared by the back door. The Wednesday after, the garden fence, broken since January, was mended with new posts that smelled of fresh oak. Lydia never mentioned the repairs. She slept in a dry room. She burned the firewood. She leaned on the fence that held. She understood what the Wednesdays were: wordless, deliberate communication of a woman who had lost a child and who recognized, in the woman next door, the beginning of the same loss. The Wednesdays continued. They understood that some forms of help are diminished by naming them. If you are still listening, if you are here with Lydia and Tom and the garden and the worm and the carriage that came on a Tuesday, thank you. You stayed. The next part of this story will test you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Another tale awaits, but this one isn't finished. Not even close. Now, back to Hartfield. The petition arrived, and the clock started. 6 weeks. Lydia read the document 3 times. It was written in the language of English law, dense, circular, designed to convey authority rather than clarity. But the core was simple. Sir Geoffrey Carlisle, baronet, petitioned for custody of Thomas James Carlisle, aged 3, on the grounds that the child's mother lacked the means, the standing, and the character to raise him. Character. The word appeared 4 times in 7 pages. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire case. Under the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, a mother could petition for custody of children under 7. Before 1839, she could not. A father or his family held absolute custody, and a mother had no legal standing at all. The Act changed this, partially, imperfectly. It allowed a mother to petition, provided she could prove she was of good character and had not been guilty of adultery. The Act did not define good character. It did not specify what evidence was sufficient. It left the definition to the magistrate, which meant that good character was whatever a man in a wig decided it was on the day he decided it, and the criteria shifted depending on the woman, the magistrate, and the social pressure applied. Sir Geoffrey's solicitor would argue that Lydia's character was insufficient. She had taken in sewing, manual labor, unsuitable for a woman of standing. She had sold vegetables, trade unbecoming. She lived alone without a companion or servant, irregular, improper. She had been seen in the garden in a muddy dress with her hair uncovered, a detail so trivial it should not have mattered and would matter enormously, because the law measured women's character in inches and appearances and the ridiculous arithmetic of respectability. Lydia needed to understand the law. She needed legal counsel. She could not afford legal counsel. A solicitor cost more than her cottage was worth. A barrister was impossible. She was a woman with £6 a year in rent, a garden, and 42 days. She went to the magistrate. Nathaniel Ward, Duke of Harlow, held the county magistracy for the Salisbury district. This was unusual. A duke serving as a local magistrate was like using a cannon to shoot rabbits, but Nathaniel Ward was an unusual duke. He was 42. He had inherited the title at 31 when his older brother died without issue, which made him a duke who had not been raised for it and who wore the title. A coat, cut for someone else, worn correctly but without comfort. He had been a barrister before the title, a good one, thorough, methodical, a lawyer who won cases not through oratory, but through preparation that left the opposing counsel with nothing to argue against because every angle had already been closed. He had kept the magistracy after inheriting because the work suited his mind and because idleness did not. He heard cases in the Salisbury court 2 days a week: petty theft, property disputes, licensing matters, and the occasional custody petition filed by a wealthy family against a woman who had committed the crime of being poor. He was tall, 6'1", and lean, the angular, spare build of a man who rode daily and forgot to eat when he was reading. His face was sharp-featured, clean-lined, with a high forehead and a jaw that came to a definite point, as though his face had been designed by someone who valued efficiency over beauty. His hair was dark brown, going gray at both temples in a way that made him look, at 42, like a man who had worried about the correct things and been right about most of them. His eyes were light gray, the gray of morning mist, the gray of a legal document, the gray of a man who dealt in facts and found emotions to be relevant but imprecise. He carried a notebook, always. A small leather-bound book in which he wrote everything: legal notes, observations, the names of defendants and the dates of hearings, and occasionally, when no one was looking, the first line of a thought he did not know how to finish. His wife, Charlotte, had died 5 years ago. Scarlet fever. They had been married for 8 years and had no children, not from choice, but from the body's refusal to cooperate with the life they had planned. The world interpreted this as Charlotte's failure, because the world always interpreted it as the woman's failure, and the medical profession of the 1830s did not bother to look anywhere else. Nathaniel did not speak about Charlotte. He kept her portrait in his study at Harlow Court. He visited her grave on Sundays. He had closed no doors. There were no doors to close, because Charlotte had not been the center of his life in the way that Marguerite had been Henry's. She had been a companion. He had loved her. The love was real, and it was quiet, and when she died, the quiet became louder, and he filled it with work. Lydia arrived at the magistrate's office in Salisbury on a Thursday morning. She wore her black morning dress, clean, pressed, the mud scrubbed from the hem. Her hair was pinned as tightly as it could be pinned, which was not tight enough. She carried the petition, the Custody of Infants Act, which she had obtained from the lending library and read 3 times, and a list of questions in small, tight, furious handwriting. She had no appointment. She told the clerk she needed 5 minutes with the magistrate. The clerk said the magistrate was occupied. She said she would wait. She sat on the bench outside his office for 3 hours because the clerk had not told the magistrate she was there, and because the clerk believed that a woman in a black dress with no appointment and no solicitor was not a priority. Nathaniel found her when he stepped out for the midday break. She was still sitting. The petition was on her lap. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded. She looked like a woman who was prepared to sit on that bench until the building fell down around her. "Can I help you?" he said. "Are you the magistrate?" "I am." "I need to understand the law." "Which law?" "The one that says I can't keep my son." Nathaniel looked at her, at the small woman in the morning dress with the black hair escaping its pins and the list of questions in small, tight handwriting. "Come in," he said. His office was plain. A desk, 2 chairs, books on every wall, law reports, case volumes, statutes, a window that looked onto the Salisbury street. Charlotte's miniature on the desk, face down because he had knocked it over reaching for a file and had not yet righted it. A notebook open beside the inkwell with half a sentence written in it. Lydia sat. She placed the petition on his desk. She placed her list of questions beside it. "I have 6 weeks," she said. "My husband's father has filed for custody of my son. My son is 3. I have no income, no solicitor, and no family with the means to help me. I have read the Custody of Infants Act. I understand that I can petition. I understand that the petition requires proof of good character. I do not understand what good character means in law because the Act does not define it, and I need to know what I am being measured against so I can decide whether the measurement is survivable." She said all of this without pausing, without emotion, with the controlled focus of a woman who had spent months surviving by turning every problem into arithmetic and who was now applying the same method to the question of whether she would lose her child. Nathaniel listened. He had been a barrister for 9 years before he became a duke. He had heard many people present their cases. Most of them were disorganized, emotional, and wrong about the law. This woman was organized, controlled, and had already identified the central weakness in her own position, the undefined standard of character. More than most solicitors managed in their first consultation. "May I see your list?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it. 12 questions, each one specific, each one aimed at a gap in the act. He looked up. "You wrote these yourself." "I did." "You've read the act 3 times. Your third question. Does the act require the petitioning party to demonstrate superior character, or merely to allege deficient character in the mother?" Is the question a barrister would ask. Most barristers would not phrase it as cleanly. "I am not a barrister. I'm a mother with 6 weeks. Clarity is the only weapon I have." Nathaniel set the list down. He picked up his notebook. He wrote something: the date, her name, the case reference from the petition. "I cannot represent you," he said. "I am the magistrate for this district. If this case comes before me, I must be impartial. I should not even be having this conversation." "Then why are you?" He paused. The question was direct in a way he was not accustomed to, unwilling to accept a deflection as an answer. "Because you have read the act 3 times and written 12 questions and sat on a bench for 3 hours without complaint, and the clerk did not tell me you were here, and that failure is mine to correct." That is a procedural answer. I am a procedural man. I don't need a procedural man. I need someone who can tell me whether the law is going to take my son. Nathaniel looked at her, at the hands folded in her lap, small hands, thin-wristed, the nails short. From gardening, the fingers ink-stained, at the black dress, at the one curl that had already fallen across her forehead. "The law is going to try," he said. "Whether it succeeds depends on what you do in the next 6 weeks." "Tell me what to do." "Come back tomorrow. Bring the act, your list, and every document you have. Marriage certificate, your husband's death certificate, the trust paperwork, anything that establishes your identity and your marriage. I will explain the law. I will not represent you, but I will make sure you understand what you are fighting." "Why?" "Because the act was written to protect mothers. It is being used to punish one, and that is a misuse of the law I am sworn to administer." He stood. The meeting was over. He opened the door. She stood. She collected her petition and her list. At the door, she stopped. "Your Grace." "Yes." "The clerk told me you were occupied. I sat for 3 hours. If I am going to come back tomorrow, I would prefer not to sit for 3 hours again. I will inform the clerk." "Thank you." She left. Nathaniel sat at his desk. He picked up Charlotte's miniature and righted it. He looked at it for a moment, the painted face, the familiar features, and then he opened his notebook and wrote, beneath the date and the name and the case reference, "She is going to fight. The question is whether the law will let her." She came back, every day, for 6 weeks, not to his chambers. That would have been noticed, gossiped about, and used against her. They met in the back room of the Salisbury Lending Library, where the librarian, a quiet man named Mr. Poole, who believed that access to information was a right and not a privilege, allowed them use of a table between the hours of 8 and 10 in the morning before the library opened to the public. Lydia brought documents. Nathaniel brought the law. They argued, not about the case, about the law itself, about what character meant, about whether the act had been written to protect women, or to give them the illusion of protection while leaving the definition of good in the hands of men who had never washed a child or cooked a meal or sat on a kitchen floor at midnight with a 3-year-old who was crying for a father who was not coming back. "The law says I must prove good character," Lydia said on the 3rd morning. "What does the law require of Sir Geoffrey? He must prove means, money, property, servants. That is not character, that is arithmetic. The law does not claim to be fair. The law claims to be just. If it is not fair, it is not just. It is merely orderly. Order is the law's primary function. Then the law has confused its function with its purpose. A prison is orderly. That does not make it just." Nathaniel wrote this down. He wrote everything down. The notebook filled with her arguments, her objections, her questions, and, increasingly, with observations he did not intend to make. The way she pressed her index finger against her lower lip when she was thinking. The way her hair escaped its pins by the 2nd hour, always the same curl, always over the left eye. The way she said, "my son," not possessively, not desperately, but with the simple, factual certainty of a woman stating something that should not need to be stated. On the 6th morning, after she had gone, he sat at the table and reviewed his notes. The first 2 pages were case law. The 3rd was a list of precedents he had pulled from the Salisbury court records. The 4th page, the one he had written while she was talking about the hedge she had planted to keep Tom out of the lane, read, "Hedge, hawthorn. She dug the holes herself. Hands too small for the spade handle, she said. Used a trowel instead. Took 4 days. The hedge is 3 feet tall." He stared at the page. This was not case law. This was not a precedent. This was a man writing down that a woman had planted a hedge with a trowel because a spade was too large for her hands, and he had written it because the image of those hands, small, ink-stained, gripping a trowel in January mud, had stayed with him through an entire evening and into the next morning. He did not cross it out. He turned the page and continued with the case notes. The hawthorn hedge remained in the notebook between a statute reference and a list of character witnesses as the first piece of evidence that Nathaniel Ward was no longer impartial about anything. He taught her the law. She taught him what the law felt like from the inside. On the 4th morning she brought Tom. Not deliberately. Mrs. Lowell was unwell, and there was no one else. Tom sat under the table with a biscuit and a wooden horse, and the patience of a child who has learned to be quiet because quiet is safer. Halfway through the session, the biscuit ran out. Tom emerged from under the table, walked to Nathaniel, and placed the wooden horse on his notebook. "This is Geoffrey," Tom said. "He's a horse. I can see that. He doesn't have a tail. Mama says it fell off." "Did it?" "Mama says everything falls off eventually. Do you have a biscuit?" Nathaniel did not have a biscuit. He had a peppermint, which he offered with the cautious uncertainty of a man who has not interacted with a child in several years and is not sure of the protocol. Tom took the peppermint. He examined it. He placed it on the horse. "Geoffrey wants it," he said. "He's hungry. Horses don't eat peppermints. Geoffrey does." Tom returned under the table. Nathaniel looked at the wooden horse on his notebook, tailless and hungry. He looked at Lydia, who was watching him with an expression he could not read, something more complicated than gratitude, watching the man who holds her legal future fumble with the child that future was about. "He's named the horse after Sir Geoffrey," Nathaniel said. "I know. That seems significant. It's a 3-year-old's understanding of irony. He doesn't know what Sir Geoffrey is doing. He knows the name. He gave it to a horse with no tail. The metaphor is not subtle. He's 3. Subtlety is not in the curriculum." They returned to the law. Under the table, Tom fed the peppermint to Geoffrey. The morning continued. The library was quiet. The case was building. On the 9th morning, Nathaniel told her what the opposing solicitor would argue. He had seen enough custody cases to know the pattern. They will present 3 arguments. First, means. Sir Geoffrey has wealth, property, servants, a household capable of raising a child to his station. You have a cottage, a garden, and no income. The material case is unanswerable. They have more than you. Material is not moral. The law often confuses the two. Second, standing. Sir Geoffrey is a baronet. Your husband was a baronet's younger son. You are a clergyman's daughter. They will argue that the child's station, his name, his connections, his future, requires a household that matches his birth. A Carlisle should be raised as a Carlisle. A Carlisle should be raised by his mother. That is your argument. It is not theirs. Third, and this is where they will aim, character. The word sat between them. The word that appeared 4 times in the petition. The word the law refused to define. They know you have taken in sewing. They know you have sold vegetables. They know you live without a servant or companion. They will argue that these are evidence not of resourcefulness but of decline, that a woman who must sew to survive has fallen below the standard required to raise a child of standing. They will not say you are a bad mother. They will say you are an insufficient one. Insufficiency is harder to disprove than wickedness, because wickedness requires evidence and insufficiency requires only comparison. Comparison to whom? To them, to what they can offer. The comparison is unfair. The law allows it. Lydia was quiet for a long time. The library was still. Tom was not under the table this morning. Mrs. Lowell had recovered and was watching him, and the absence of his noise made the room feel larger and emptier. "What do I do?" she asked. Not with defeat. With the controlled focus of a woman who has identified the battlefield and is planning her defense. You change the question. They will ask, can she provide? You must make the hearing ask a different question. Can she mother? Those are not the same question. Provision is arithmetic. Mothering is not. And how do I make the hearing ask my question instead of theirs? You tell them what you do, not what you have. What you do. Every morning, every bedtime, every meal, every story, every hour of every day. You make the magistrate see the child's life. Not the cottage, not the garden, not the income. The life. He paused. He set down his pen. He looked at her with the gray eyes that dealt in facts. And you need a character witness. Someone who has seen you mother that boy every day. Someone the magistrate will believe. Lydia walked home that afternoon with the word character turning in her head like a wheel. She came through the garden gate and found Tom sitting on the step with Geoffrey the horse in one hand and a dandelion in the other. He had picked every dandelion in the front garden. They were arranged in a row along the step, 12 of them, stems bent, heads drooping, lined up with the careful order of a child who is doing something important and does not yet know why. "What are you doing?" she asked. "These are Geoffrey's soldiers," he said. "They are guarding the door." "From what?" He considered this. "From the people who come in carriages." She sat on the step beside him. She did not speak. She picked up one of the dandelion soldiers and held it, and the weight of 12 legal sessions and 40 pages of notes and the word insufficient landing in a courtroom dissolved into a 3-year-old's understanding of the threat. Not as law, not as custody, not as character. As people in carriages who might come through the door. He had built an army from weeds. He had placed it between himself and the thing he was afraid of. Lydia put the dandelion back in line. She straightened its stem. "Good soldiers," she said. "The best," Tom said. "Geoffrey trained them. Mrs. Lowell." "The woman next door?" "She watches. She doesn't say much, but she watches." "Will she testify?" "I'll ask," she asked. Ada Lowell was in her garden, cutting back dead stalks with a pair of shears that were older than Lydia. She kept cutting when Lydia came to the fence. "I need a favor," Lydia said. "You need a witness." Lydia stopped. "How did you know?" "I have been fixing your roof and your fence and stacking your firewood for 6 months, Lydia. I am not unobservant. Your in-laws arrived in a carriage with a legal document. You have been going to Salisbury every morning for 2 weeks. The magistrate is advising you, and you need someone to stand in a courtroom and say what I see through my window." "Yes." Ada cut a dead stalk, set it aside, cut another. "What I see through my window," she said, "is a woman on her knees in a garden with a boy who talks to worms. I see a woman who reads to him every night. I can hear it through the wall when the windows are open. I see a woman who has not bought herself a new dress in 6 months, but who has remade her dead husband's shirts into clothes for her son with stitching so careful it looks machine-made. I see a woman who is exhausted and frightened and alone, and who has not once, in 6 months, raised her voice to that child." She set down the shears. "I had a son," she said. "Peter. He died when he was 7. Scarlet fever. That was 20 years ago, and I still wake up some mornings and listen for his voice before I remember." She looked at Lydia. The January flagstone face held something underneath it, something that had been buried for 20 years and was being deliberately, carefully brought to the surface. "I will stand in any room and tell any man in any wig what I see through my window. And if that is not enough for the law, then the law is not good enough for you." The hearing was scheduled for the 15th of September, a Tuesday, in a room at the Salisbury courthouse that smelled of old wood and ink and the accumulated anxiety of every person who had ever stood in it and asked the law to be kind. Sir Geoffrey arrived with his solicitor, Mr. Payne, a thin man with careful hands and the rehearsed politeness of a person who destroys people's lives in well-constructed sentences. Lady Frances sat behind him. She wore grey silk, the jet brooch, the pearl earrings. She looked at Lydia the way she had looked at the cottage, with evaluation, not contempt. The evaluation was worse. Lydia arrived alone. She had no solicitor. She had her documents, her list of questions, and a dress that was clean and pressed and black and the only dress she owned. Tom was with Mrs. Lowell. Nathaniel was not presiding. He had recused himself. Conflict of interest, he told the court, because he had provided legal guidance to one of the parties. The case was heard by Mr. Justice Hargrove, an elderly magistrate from the neighboring district, a man with white whiskers and small, careful eyes that gave nothing away. The solicitor spoke first. He was good. He was thorough. He presented Sir Geoffrey's case in clean, measured paragraphs: the wealth, the property, the household, the governess already engaged, the schooling planned, the future mapped out for a boy who deserved more than a cottage and a garden and a mother who took in sewing. He did not call Lydia a bad mother. He called her an admirable woman in difficult circumstances, whose love for her child is not in question, but whose capacity to provide the life that child deserves is regrettably insufficient. The word insufficient did the work. It landed in the room like a stone in still water, Lady Frances testified. She spoke softly. She spoke about her son, about Thomas, who had been kind and impractical and loved, and whose death had left a hole in the family that the boy, young Thomas, could help fill. She did not say, "We want to replace our son with our grandson." She said, "We want to give our grandson every advantage his father would have wanted for him." The sentence was constructed perfectly. It used the dead man as a weapon against the dead man's wife. Sir Geoffrey testified. He was brief. He listed his assets. He named the governess, the tutor, the estate, the income. He said, "The boy bears our name. We wish to ensure he can bear it with the resources it requires." The magistrate turned to Lydia. "Mrs. Carlisle, you may speak." Lydia stood. She was 5'3". The room was large. The magistrate's bench was high. She was the smallest person in the room, and she knew it, and she did not compensate by raising her voice or straightening taller. She spoke at her own height, in her own voice. "My son wakes at 6 o'clock every morning. He comes to my bed and he puts his hand on my face to check that I am there. He does this because his father died 6 months ago, and he has learned that people disappear. He checks every morning that I have not disappeared. I get up, I dress him, I make his breakfast. Porridge, with honey when we have it, without when we don't. He sits at the kitchen table and he eats, and he tells me about his dreams, which are complicated and usually involve animals. Yesterday the dream involved a horse named Geoffrey who could fly. I don't know where the flying came from. The horse is named after his grandfather. After breakfast we go to the garden. He digs. I garden. He talks to worms. He has explained to me on multiple occasions that worms live in the ground because they don't have legs, and that this is not the worm's fault. I agree with him. It is not the worm's fault. In the afternoon I sew, he plays, he builds things from sticks and stones and whatever he finds in the garden. Last week he built a house for a beetle. The house had a door. The beetle did not use the door. Tom was upset. I explained that beetles have their own ideas about architecture. He accepted this. In the evening I read to him, every night. I promised his father I would. I read him a story about a badger who lives under a hill. The story has no ending because every night he asks, "And then what happened?" And every night I tell him, and every night the badger survives. I do not know what will happen when the story ends. I hope it never does. He sleeps. I sit in the kitchen and I sew. I mend other people's clothes so that I can keep a roof over my son's head. This is not a failure of character. This is a mother working. If the law considers a woman who works to feed her child to be unfit, then the law is measuring the wrong thing. Sir Geoffrey can offer my son a large house, a governess, a tutor, and an income. He cannot offer my son a mother. He cannot offer my son the hand on his face at 6 in the morning. He cannot offer the badger story. He cannot offer the worm. He cannot offer the knowledge, which Tom has and which Tom needs, that the one person in the world who will never disappear is still there when he wakes. Taking him from this cottage does not give him a father. His father is dead. It gives him 2 grandparents in the absence of both parents. I am asking you to weigh that. Not the money, not the house, the absence. She sat down. The room was quiet. The quiet lasted longer than it should have, which meant something, though Lydia did not know yet what. Mrs. Lowell was called. She stood. She was short and broad, and her steel-gray hair was cut with kitchen scissors, and she wore a dress that was clean but not fine, and she looked at the magistrate without deference, because Ada Lowell had survived the death of a child and a husband and 30 years alone, and there was no man in a wig who could intimidate her. "I live next door to Mrs. Carlisle," she said. "I have lived next door for 15 years. I knew her husband. I know her son. I know what I see through my window every day. What I see is a mother who gardens and sews and reads, and who has not, in 6 months, raised her voice to that child, not once. I hear them through the wall. I hear the stories at bedtime. I hear the boy laugh. I hear the boy cry for his father, and I hear her hold him while he cries. and I hear her not promise him it will be all right, because she is not a woman who lies to her child. I had a son. His name was Peter. He died when he was 7. I would give everything I own, every fence I have mended, every slate I have laid, every year I have left, to have back what you are trying to take from her." She sat down. She looked at Lydia. Only at Lydia, and the January flagstone face held for one moment the full weight of 20 years of loss offered as evidence. The magistrate deliberated for 40 minutes. 40 minutes in which Lydia sat with her hands folded and her heart in her throat, and the entire architecture of her life, the garden, the bedtime stories, the hand on her face at 6 in the morning, suspended on the opinion of a man she had never met. He returned. He read his decision. The child would remain with his mother. The grounds, the Custody of Infants Act, was designed to protect the bond between mother and child, not to sever it on the basis of economic disparity. The mother's character was not in question. A woman who works to feed her child is not unfit. She is resourceful. The court noted that the petitioner's material advantages, while considerable, did not constitute a moral argument, and that the removal of a child from a loving mother to a household of strangers, however well appointed, was not in the interest of the child. The magistrate added in a note that would not appear in the official record, but that Lydia would remember for the rest of her life, "This court has heard a great deal about what the boy deserves. It has heard very little about what the boy needs. What the boy needs is his mother." Lydia stood. She walked out of the courtroom. She walked through the courthouse. She walked out the front door into the September afternoon, where the light was golden and the air was warm, and the chestnut trees along the street were beginning to turn. And then she sat on the courthouse steps, and she put her face in her hands, and she cried. Not the silent, controlled crying she had done every night for 6 months at the kitchen table with her forehead on the wood. The other kind. The kind that comes when the thing you were holding together lets go. Nathaniel found her on the steps. He stood 3 feet away, unsure whether his presence was welcome, unwilling to leave. "Mrs. Carlisle." She looked up. Her face was wet. Her hair was down. The pins had finally given up entirely. "Your Grace." The decision was correct. "I know. I heard it. I mean, the law was applied correctly. Mr. Justice Hargrove interpreted the act as it was intended. The character standard was met. The material argument was rejected. The ruling is sound. Are you reviewing the case, or are you speaking to me?" He stopped. The precision faltered. The man who wrote everything in notebooks and dealt in facts and found emotions to be relevant but imprecise stood on the courthouse steps and found that precision was not the right tool for this moment. "I am speaking to you," he said. "Badly." "Yes, you are. I have been told this before. Charlotte, my wife, used to say that I communicated the way other people filed documents, accurately, but without warmth. Your wife sounds like she was right." "She was right about most things." He paused. "I would like to walk you home, if you would allow it. I live 4 miles from here. I am aware. That is a long walk. I am aware of that also." Lydia looked at him, at the tall, lean, angular man with the gray eyes and the notebook in his pocket, and the gray at his temples, and the look of a man who has offered something and is waiting. She stood up from the steps. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her hair was everywhere. Her dress was creased from sitting. She was 30 years old, and she had just won the most important fight of her life, and she was exhausted, and she was standing on the courthouse steps with a duke who spoke like a filing cabinet, and she almost laughed. 4 miles, she said. Try to keep up. Epilogue. He did not keep up. She walked fast. the stride of a woman who had somewhere to be and someone waiting, and Nathaniel, who was taller by 10 inches, found himself half a step behind for the entire 4 miles. He adjusted. They arrived at the cottage as the light was going gold. Mrs. Lowell was in the garden next door, cutting back the last of the summer runner beans. Tom was digging in the vegetable patch with his wooden spoon. He looked up when they came through the gate. "Mama!" He dropped the spoon. He ran. He collided with Lydia's legs with the full-body impact of a 3-year-old who has been waiting and who does not understand why he was waiting, but understands that the waiting is over. She picked him up. She held him. She pressed her face into his brown curls that were his father's and breathed him in, the dirt, the garden, the biscuit Mrs. Lowell had given him, the smell of a child who has been playing outside all day and who smells like everything that is alive. "I found another worm," he said. "Did you? This one is bigger. Mrs. Lowell says it's a different species." "Mrs. Lowell would know." Nathaniel stood at the gate. He was not part of this scene, and he knew it. He stood and watched a mother hold her son in a garden, and he thought about Charlotte, who had wanted children and had not had them, and about the law, which had been written by men who had never stood in a garden and watched this, and who had decided, from their desks and their benches and their leather chairs, what a mother was worth. Tom noticed him. He looked at Nathaniel over Lydia's shoulder with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some people require deference. "Do you have a peppermint?" he asked. "I might. Geoffrey wants one." "The horse?" "He's hungry again." Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket. He did, in fact, have a peppermint. He had been carrying peppermints since the morning Tom had placed the wooden horse on his notebook, because Nathaniel Ward was a man who prepared for every contingency, including the contingency of a tailless horse named after a baronet. He held it out. Tom took it, examined it, nodded with approval, placed it in his pocket for later delivery to Geoffrey. "You can come in," Tom said, "if you want." Lydia looked at her son. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at the garden, the cottage, the runner beans, the wormhole Tom had been excavating, the light going gold on the south wall where the sweet peas were still blooming. "Would you like to stay for supper?" she said. "It's not much. Soup, vegetables from the garden, Mrs. Lowell's bread." "I would like that." "It will not be what you're used to." "I am not interested in what I'm used to." They went inside. The cottage was small and warm and smelled like earth, and the herbs Lydia had hung to dry in the kitchen: thyme, rosemary, sage. Tom sat at the table and fed peppermints to Geoffrey. Lydia made soup. Nathaniel sat in a chair that was too small for him and opened his notebook and then closed it, because this was not a moment for writing things down. This was a moment for being present in a kitchen with a woman and a boy and a horse with no tail. They ate. The soup was good, not complex, potato and leek, flavored with thyme from the garden. Tom told Nathaniel about the worm, about the beetle house that the beetle had refused to use, about the badger who lived under a hill and who had 17 children and a complicated relationship with foxes. "Does the badger have a name?" Nathaniel asked. "Badger," Tom said. "Mama says names should be honest." Nathaniel looked at Lydia. She was watching Tom the way she always watched him, a woman who knew exactly what she had almost lost and who would never, for the rest of her life, take a single bedtime story for granted. "Your mother," Nathaniel said, "is right about most things." "I know," Tom said. "She's Mama." Nathaniel came back. Not the next day. That would have been noticed. The following Saturday. He brought a book. It was a natural history of Wiltshire, illustrated with engravings of birds and insects and plants, intended for adults, but which Tom, propped on Lydia's lap, examined with the serious focus of a scholar reviewing primary sources. "That's a beetle," Tom said, pointing. "It is. Does it have a house?" "The book doesn't say." "It should." Nathaniel made a note in his notebook. Lydia saw him write it and did not ask what he had written, because she was beginning to understand that the notebook was not just a professional tool. It was how he processed the world. Other men thought. Nathaniel wrote. The pen was his way of holding things, the way Tom held the wooden spoon, the way Lydia held her hands flat on the table when the grief came. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He brought books for Tom, a bird guide, a collection of illustrated fables, a primer on garden insects that Tom referred to as the Beetle Book, and that he slept with for 3 weeks until the cover came loose, and Lydia had to rebind it with thread. He and Lydia talked. In the garden, while Tom dug. In the kitchen, while the soup cooked. On the lane, walking to the village shop, Tom between them, holding one hand each, swinging. They did not talk about the case. They talked about Charlotte, about Thomas, about the specific different shapes of the empty spaces their deaths had left. Lydia's space was loud. A 3-year-old filled it with noise and need and the daily exhausting essential work of mothering. Nathaniel's space was quiet. A house with no children, a desk with a miniature, a notebook half full of thoughts he could not finish. "You write in your notebook instead of saying things," Lydia said on the 4th Saturday. "I write because saying things requires an audience, and I have not had an audience in 5 years." "You have one now." He looked at her, at the dark blue eyes, at the black hair escaping, always escaping, at the small woman sitting in her garden with soil on her hands and her dead husband's son on her lap, and the absolute, stubborn, immovable certainty that this, the garden, the soup, the worm, was enough. "I know," he said. He wrote it in the notebook. She saw him write it, and this time she smiled. The small, specific smile of a woman who has caught a man in the act of feeling something and is choosing not to embarrass him about it. Sir Geoffrey did not appeal. The decision stood. He sent a letter, not an apology, but an acknowledgment. "The court has ruled. We do not agree, but we will respect the ruling." Lady Frances sent nothing. The silence from the Carlisle estate was total and permanent, the way silence is when pride has been wounded, and the wound is too deep for the pride to admit it exists. Lydia framed the court decision. She hung it in the kitchen, beside the window that looked out on the garden, not as a trophy, as a reminder that the law had almost taken her son, and that a woman's voice, spoken at her own height in her own words, had been enough, that Mrs. Lowell's Wednesdays and testimony had been enough, that stubbornness and fury and a list of 12 questions had been enough. Tom grew. He talked to worms. He built houses for beetles. He named his horse after his grandfather and fed it peppermints and asked every night, "And then what happened?" And every night the badger survived. Nathaniel kept coming, every Saturday, then Wednesdays too, then some mornings before court, when he would stop at the cottage gate and Tom would run out with Geoffrey the horse and demand a peppermint, and Nathaniel would produce one from his pocket with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had learned that preparedness was a form of love. On a Saturday in November, the 3 of them walked to the village shop, Tom between them, holding one hand each, swinging. Nathaniel carried the basket because Lydia's hands were too small for the handle and the basket and a 3-year-old simultaneously, and he was learning, that the correct response to a woman who refused help was to pick up the basket without asking and walk slightly behind her so she could pretend she had not noticed. Tom found a puddle. He stood in the middle of it and looked up at them with the expression of a child conducting an experiment. "It's cold," he reported. "Come out of the puddle, Tom," Lydia said. "I'm testing it." "You have tested it. The result is cold. Come out." "Geoffrey wants to test it too. Geoffrey is a wooden horse. Geoffrey does not have opinions about puddles." Tom placed Geoffrey in the puddle. Geoffrey floated briefly, then tipped over. "He failed the test," Tom said with the seriousness of a scientist recording a negative result. Nathaniel fished Geoffrey out of the puddle. He dried the horse on his coat, his good coat, the one his valet had pressed that morning. Lydia watched him do this. She watched a duke dry a wooden horse on a coat that cost more than her cottage rent, without hesitation, without commentary, as though rescuing toy. Horses from puddles were a standard function of the English peerage. She did not say anything, but something shifted in her face that Nathaniel noticed and filed in the part of the notebook he kept only in his head. He did not propose, not for a long time. When he did, it was in the garden on a Saturday, while Tom was explaining to a snail the importance of having a house you could carry with you. "I would like to be here," Nathaniel said. "Not on Saturdays. Every day." "That is not a proposal." "I am aware. I am building to it. The structure requires a foundation." "You are proposing the way you write legal briefs." "I am proposing the way I know how." "Which is badly. Charlotte told me I communicate like a filing cabinet. You have agreed with this assessment. I am a man who writes things in notebooks because speaking them is harder. But what I want to say, and what I have written in this notebook 47 times without finding the correct phrasing, is that I would like to be here. With you, with Tom, with the soup and the garden and the horse with no tail. I would like to stop being a man who visits and start being a man who stays. 47 times? I counted. You would. Is that a yes?" Lydia looked at him, at the tall, lean, angular man with the gray eyes and the gray at his temples and the notebook full of 47 attempts. She looked at Tom, who was now placing the snail on Geoffrey's back, creating what he called a horse ride for snails. She looked at the garden. The runner beans were climbing their frames. The sweet peas were blooming on the south wall. The cottage was small and warm and hers. "It is a yes," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "We live here, not at Harlow Court. Here, the cottage, the garden. Tom keeps his room, the chickens stay, and you learn to make soup." "I have never made soup." "Then you have something to learn. That should appeal to a man who writes everything down." He took out his notebook. He wrote, "Soup, learn." Lydia laughed. The laugh was sudden, full, and startled Tom, who looked up from the snail with the expression of a child who has heard something rare and wants to hear it again. "Again," Tom said. "Again what?" "The laughing. Do it again." She did, and Nathaniel, who had spent 5 years in a quiet house filling notebooks with thoughts he could not finish, sat in a garden with a woman and a boy and a horse and a snail, and he finished a thought, not in the notebook, in the world. He stayed for supper. He stayed for the bedtime story. He sat beside Lydia on the floor of Tom's room while she told the next chapter of The Badger, in which the badger, against all odds, acquired a new friend, a tall, thin owl who wrote things on leaves because he could not say them out loud. "The owl writes things?" Tom asked. "The owl writes everything." "Does the owl have a name?" "Not yet. What do you think?" Tom considered this with the gravity of a 3-year-old making a decision of consequence. "Nathaniel," he said. Lydia looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Lydia. The moment held them in the small room with the small bed, and the small boy and the badger story that would never end. "Nathaniel the Owl," she said. "That's a good name." "I know," Tom said. "He writes things, like the real one." And the real one, the man with the notebook and the peppermints and the 47 attempts, sat on the floor of a cottage in Wiltshire and was named by a 3-year-old and did not write it down because some things do not need to be written. They need only to be lived. And that is the story of the woman they told was not fit, and the law that tried to take her son, and the garden where the worms lived and the beetles refused their houses, and the runner beans climbed their frames, and the man who came on Saturdays and then stayed. The law has changed since 1843. Not enough. The question of what a mother is worth, the question Lydia asked in a courthouse in Salisbury, in her own voice, at her own height, is still being asked, in courtrooms and in kitchens and in gardens, where women hold their children and are told that holding is not enough. It is enough. It has always been enough. Thank you for being here tonight. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this place. And this place is for the mothers, the ones who sew by candlelight, the ones who dig in gardens, the ones who read bedtime stories that never end, because as long as the story continues, the child is still here. If this stayed with you, tell me where it landed. Was it the carriage on a Tuesday? The worm that went back? The roof patched at 7 in the morning? Mrs. Lowell's testimony? The hand on her face at 6 in the morning? The horse with no tail? The 47 attempts in the notebook? Or was it the owl named Nathaniel? Drop it below. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed, the next story is already growing in a courtroom where a woman was told she wasn't fit. She stood up anyway. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, a woman who works to feed her child is not unfit. She is a mother, and mothering is not measured in money. It is measured in mornings. Good night. I'll see you in the next one.